this is a very participatory sport. I think the best way is to contribute with your time. The question is not what something is worth. It's not a quantitative question. It's about you. Most art sucks. And I have to say, I agree with that. But the irony is what I think is great is going to be different from what you think is great.
Welcome to Vita Brevis, a podcast about business, art, life, and death. I'm your host, Carlos Cardenas. Here we explore how business, creativity, and philanthropy intersect through the lives of remarkable people. I talk with entrepreneurs and community leaders who are passionate collectors and visionary patrons to discover how art shapes their work, purpose, and legacy. Because life is short, but art is forever.
Chers amis, queridos amigos, and dear friends of the pod, welcome back to Vita Brevis. Today's episode, The Architectures of Value, How Art, Capital, and Creativity Shape What Lasts, is a little different from our usual interview format. A few weeks ago, I was invited to give a presentation at the second course lecture series here in Austin. A special thank you to Sydney Ramon for the invitation. It gave me the opportunity to bring together ideas I've been exploring on this podcast over the last few months, and honestly, ideas that have been kicking around in my head for decades. As you probably know, or have surmised if you're a regular listener, this whole exercise is much more than an explanation of the fine art market. My thesis as an educator explores the economics of scarcity and abundance through the lens of institutional and popular culture. How different kinds of capital add value to brands, the built environment, quality of life, purpose, and legacy. With examples as varied as Taylor Swift, Prada Marfa, Louis Vuitton, Hello Kitty, and a $6 million banana. I hope you find it both thoughtful and entertaining. Because at the end of the day, finance determines what gets built, but culture determines what is remembered.
Thank you all so much for being here. My name is Sydney, and I'm the founder of the second course. We host live lecture series like this every single month. So without further ado, let me introduce our speaker for this evening, Carlos Cardenas, real estate developer, investment sponsor, art dealer, and licensed fiduciary. A Cal Arts MFA with a BS in international business and a Series 65. He has originated, structured, and exited alternative investment vehicles across the full life cycle, and has designed co-ownership syndications and auction guarantee structures for liquid cultural assets. In 2023, he executed a world auction record at a Sotheby's evening sale, deploying a third-party guarantee and fractional co-ownership structure. He has taught art economics at Parsons Paris and hosts Vita Brevis, Art, Business, Life, and Death, a podcast with and for entrepreneurs who are patrons, philanthropists, and community leaders, grounded in a simple conviction: life is short, but art is forever. Welcome, Carlos.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. Thank you all for coming. I'm glad it's not hot out. Let's get started here. So the views expressed in here are for educational entertainment purposes only and do not constitute legal, tax, or investment advice. I'm here essentially to entertain you. Let's just say that. All right. So this is the theme of our evening. So we're going to be looking at culture and capital and what the overlap is. There's going to be lots of ways to look at this, and we're going to come to something of a conclusion, but essentially we're going to be talking about that overlap and to see how this hopefully makes sense to a degree. Now, why me? Sydney did mention some of this, but I'll just go over this a little bit. So I am working at the intersection of culture and capital, both in practice and in theory. So what that means is, on the practical side for capital, I do some real estate development, which is essentially ground up development, land development. There's been a few projects and hopefully there's one coming up soon, but we'll see about that. I am an art dealer, a private art dealer, and I still continue doing that. On the theory side, I'm an educator. I mean, I'd like to share my experience, and this event this evening is an example of that. And we did talk about the podcast here. There'll be a QR code later, so if you guys want to listen to it. So let's talk about some other ways that we can look at our basic Venn diagram here. So we could also look at culture and capital and their overlap. Maybe it's design. If we're looking at qualitative features and quantitative features, there's an overlap where we could talk about design. It's a very broad term. But once again, as we go through these examples, hopefully this will start to get a little bit more clear. Another way of looking at it is that it could be the overlap between the humanities and the sciences. Is this where innovation lives? I think somebody like Steve Jobs would probably, be a party of that. He very much considered himself, at the very least, a designer, if not an artist. So he was at this bridge between science and the humanities. For our purposes, we're going to be focusing on this relationship here, that the overlap between art and finance is actually architecture. Okay? Once again, we'll see plenty of examples of this. Now, how is this the case? Finance determines what gets built. What I mean by that is that this is how things get built. Architecture is expensive. I mean, look around, there's tens of millions of dollars right around us. Culture determines what is remembered, meaning that this is the sort of why we do this in the first place. Okay, to build things that last. Hopefully, that's not necessarily always the case, and we're going to see a few examples of that. Architecture is where the two forces become visible. This is kind of a basic thesis of mine that when we talk about art and culture, it's much broader than paintings, sculptures, and things that we sort of consume from a cultural level. It's bigger than that. It's the built environment. It's a really, really deep and vast field. So we're going to kick off with a few visuals here, and I'm going to start with something that probably seems obvious. So I apologize if that's the case, but everybody knows this image, right? And what does it represent? This is historical. It's monumental. This is part of our collective history, our cultural heritage. I mean, this is deep, important stuff when we talk about something like, Da Vinci and the Mona Lisa. How about our friend Taylor? Is she the opposite of that? What's the relationship? Here we're talking about what's the opposite of, ancient, young, celebrity, part of the star system, let's say, as opposed to something that's historical. And I'm going to talk about a third example here, and we're going to have a little crossover. This is Andy Warhol's Marilyn. So there's a few things about this work to consider. So Marilyn Monroe, much like Taylor Swift, was a celebrity at the time, okay? Considered part of popular culture. You kind of get the picture. Andy Warhol painted Marilyn, this version of Marilyn, soon after her death. And that was very controversial at the time. People were not happy with Andy Warhol. They thought it was disgusting and exploitative, and like nobody wanted to buy this thing. Today, it is the third most expensive artwork ever sold. $195 million, I believe. And it has become akin to, I don't want to say the Mona Lisa necessarily, but it's become monumental. It's become historical. It's something really, really important and part of our collective heritage. So now we can talk about the value of art. This is a little bit complicated, and there's going to be a couple of slides here that sort of talk about this idea of value and capital. We'll get to that in a second. The first value of art is intellectual, meaning that these are objects of contemplation. Sometimes we find them beautiful, sometimes we find them interesting. In any case, they are things that are meant to enrich our lives, enrich our sort of conversations, our discourse, etc. And this is where the second value comes in. The value of art is also social. When you go to art events, very often, most of the time, you'll be with other people. You'll be talking about what you see in front of you. And the value comes from those discussions. So I heard an interesting proposition once about art saying that it is an object and the conversation around the object. It's true. The conversation, the social dynamic is what gives it meaning, what sort of gives it a narrative. And the third one, this is a complicated one, especially coming from like an art dealer. But very simply put, art was never designed to be a financial instrument. So when you see things about the financialization of art, or I don't know, buy such and such artist because it's going to go up in value, please be very, very skeptical of that. It's not its primary function. So we can illustrate this with this example here. You guys know about the banana, right? Mauricio Catalan's banana. Something interesting here. That's a real banana, and that's real duct tape. Okay, they bought the banana from a bodega across the street, and it was literally 35 cents. The banana, as an artwork, it's called Comedian, by the way, sold for a little over $5 million. So the material value is next to nothing, and the artistic value is, $5 million. Same artist did I don't want to say a companion piece, but it's definitely in dialogue. So this is a solid gold toilet. This was literally installed at the Guggenheim, and its material value was almost $10 million. That also sold for $10 million. What does that tell us? That tells us that the artwork on the right, as an artwork, not the material value of, what made it, is practically worthless. The banana on the left is worth $5 million. I don't know if you guys kind of see the irony in that. The banana is worth a lot more than the gold in this case, especially when we're thinking about the meaning of the artwork itself. And I cannot skip Marcel Duchamp. If any of you guys took art history, you might remember this. This is Marcel Duchamp's fountain, and this is literally made 1917. Huge artist, and I cannot not talk about him after the Mauricio Catalan stuff, because he was sort of the father of conceptual art, and he sort of was the first person to really bring up this strange idea of what is value in culture. So we can also address different kinds of capital. We always assume financial capital. That's on the list. We all know what that is. But there's social capital, right? How other people see you, what they think of you. For example, these are all kind of complicated, but we'll just kind of go through the list. There's symbolic capital. The brand on the clothing you wear might mean something or have value to somebody, right? Car you drive, etc. I mean, there's lots of symbols that sort of have a certain weight, a certain kind of value. Cultural capital, which is essentially what we're talking about today. Human capital, or let's just call it human resources. Financial, everybody kind of knows what that is. I want to add a last kind of capital here. This is sort of existential capital. What brings value to you in your life? What makes you fulfilled? What makes you feel loved, feel pride, etc.? This is a very, very important part of, I'm calling it existential capital, but it's a deeply human need. So the question is, when we talk about value in art, what are you trying to maximize? Is it a combination of different kinds of capital we discussed and some of the values? It's slippery, okay? It's not cut and dry and an obvious question. So you need to ask yourself, well, why are you doing this? Why are you interested? What can you get out of it? So we'll talk a little bit about the ecosystem, because there is an industry. The art market is what, a $60 billion industry, which by the way is tiny, of course. But there are made of commercial galleries and art fairs. And these are commercial enterprises where they're trying to sell work for essentially commissions. Auction houses are kind of akin to, I don't want to say like a trading room floor, but it's something like that. Private dealers, these are similar to auction houses, but they're private transactions. They're not public transactions. Academics and curators are, of course, the intellectuals and the sort of bring the narrative and write the books and things like this. Of course, we have museums and nonprofits. We have advisors. Advisors essentially build collections. And this is kind of a newer thing, but recently we have sort of private bankers that have entered the space. And they work with sort of financial instruments that are tied or backed by artworks. Complicated stuff. It can get really complicated. You guys cannot see this. 6 inches away. I can barely read what all of these things. My point is that this is a map that Andrea Fraser, who's a conceptual artist, she sort of mapped out the art ecosystem, and it's really, really complicated, you guys. On the left side, we see high cultural capital and low economic capital, and on the right side, high economic capital and low cultural capital. On the bottom means like low power, inspiring and young. On the top, it's established, old, dominant identities with a lot of power. Complicated stuff. There's all kinds of different players in the space. For-profit, non-profit, activist, traditional, you name it. But there is a strange logic to all of it, and I think she really nailed that. So we can talk about a couple of things in the market itself. So there's a primary market and a secondary market. The x-axis is time, and we're looking at dollar value here on the left. We're going to be talking about financial capital and financial value in these slides. But when we're talking about primary transactions, we're talking about the first time an artwork is sold. So when it comes from an artist's studio directly or through a gallery, in any case, it's the very, very first time that an artwork is sold. It's the primary market. Prices tend to be lower, and they're also extremely volatile. The truth is, you see those little dots going down. 99.9% of artworks never really have any long-term appreciation in financial value. It's not engineered for that, like I said earlier. So this is just the truth of the matter, okay? Artwork is meant to be enjoyed through other kinds of measuring sticks, okay? The three values that we talked about earlier before. Oh, going back to those three values, I need to say something. So remember, it's intellectual value, social value, and financial value. If you nail down the first two values, if you love the artwork, if it really speaks to you, if you find it beautiful or interesting, that's amazing. If you are a part of a community and you have wonderful relationships and good conversations around that object, that's wonderful. And you know what? If you check those first two boxes off, who cares about the third? Anyways, that's just something important to know, like why we're doing this. So, secondary market, when you read about artworks that sell for millions of dollars, in all likelihood, we're talking about the secondary market, which is the resale market. The artist is outside of the transaction now. This is between essentially private parties who had nothing to do with the creation of the artwork. Things do kind of stabilize on the price front. Something real, a $10 million painting will probably never lose its value entirely. So this is what I mean by stability. One thing that I bring up on occasion is when people ask, what can I sort of compare this to? You can't compare it to stocks or anything like that. Real estate, I think, is actually a decent comparison. It's not perfect, but it does give you some indications. They're both highly illiquid. They're both, generally speaking, long-term, high transaction costs. Anybody involved in real estate will tell you, carrying costs and insurance and fees, and it really adds up. Same thing in the art world. There's transportation, taxes, etc. Storage. So appreciation on the art side, well, we keep saying, I think it's pretty clear now, we don't know. It's really hard to sort of bet on that. Real estate, generally speaking, in the long term does appreciate, of course. Cash flow, certain kinds of investment real estates, generally speaking, cash flow, but art cannot generate cash flow. There is something I have to say here. The sort of classic wealth management model would allocate 5 to 10% of your net worth into what we call alternative assets. But this depends on your particular situation. So once again, this is not at all financial advice, just providing some context here. So who buys this stuff and why? Now, we don't really use these terms in the art world. If somebody starts buying art, we just, they're a collector. And I think that's fair enough. If we go into details and sort of like what's motivating them, then we can start to look at them, but we can compare these buyers compared to other kinds of investors. So, in the sort of startup space, we talk about angels who bet on dreams. They're probably going to lose their money, but it's okay because they're doing it because they want to participate in something. The price is the price of activism. Generally speaking, investors bet on more stable returns and they try to avoid loss. Okay. Speculators will bet on high returns. They should expect a loss. I always find it quite amazing when I meet people that are blatantly speculators, either in any sort of asset class, and they get really angry when they lose their money. Of course you did. You're hoping to get 1 out of 1,000, the VC space for anybody involved in that. That's a good equivalent there. And then at the end, we have what I'm calling patrons, and they bet on legacy. They're buying and they're building collections and museums and things like this because they want to build something that outlasts them. Loss is completely irrelevant for them. That's not why they're doing it. So we have some interesting examples here. Herb and Dorothy Vogel are massive, massive art collectors. Herb was a mailman. His wife was a librarian, Dorothy. They lived in New York in the 60s, by the way. And they decided very early on that they were going to take all of his money being a postman and they were going to buy art and they were going to live off of her salary. So, very modest, as you can imagine. But this was the early 60s in New York. They were buying minimalist and conceptual art for nothing. And they built a massive collection. I don't know what the value of that collection was at the end of the day, but they had over 4,000 objects. They donated it to I want to say it's the Smithsonian. And they donated artworks to public institutions in all 50 states. So, man, tip of the hat. These people are amazing.
Thank you for listening to Vita Brevis. If you know someone who would enjoy this conversation, please share it with them. A follow or review also goes a long way in helping us grow. Thank you. And remember, life is short, but art is forever.
Very different from these guys. This is the Mughrabis family. They are doing it for very different reasons. By the way, they have completely cornered the Andy Warhol market, these guys. And they do a lot of different kind of artists. So these guys are collectors, but they're maybe getting a little bit closer to the financial strategy side of this. I'm sure they do love art, but they're looking at it a lot more strategically. They're hoping to get something out of it that's, maybe beyond the intellectual and the social, but definitely the financial. But we have some other example. Craig Robbins is a real estate developer based in Miami. So Miami is booming, and it has been for, God, over 20 years now at least, okay? In large part, Craig Robbins has a lot to do with that. He developed the Wynwood Arts District in Miami. There's a lot of art there, and of course, Art Basel Miami Beach opened up there. My point is that art, in this case, was at the service of urban development. And another example of that is Dasha Sukova, who's here. And she has been building apartment buildings all over the US that are very sort of art-centric as well. So once again, these are examples of art at the service of the built environment. So there's been a lot of talk recently about the financialization of the art world. It's kind of an unfortunate thing. What these guys do is they sell fractional shares of very large paintings. They'll buy a huge Basquiat painting. They will do some legal paperwork that'll split it up into 1,000 little pieces, and you can buy a little piece of that art. But what's the problem with that? You don't live with the thing. Is there an intellectual aspect to it? You don't live with the artwork. No. The social aspect, they're treating it like it's, I don't know, like a NVIDIA stock or something. So social, no. I think they're trying to build like a membership model. And then on the financial side, once again, maybe, we'll see. Anyways, I just feel I have to address this financialization piece because this is something that we're seeing a little bit more of. All right, it's going to start getting a lot more visual here. So this is the Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao that was designed by Frank Gehry. There's a term now called the Bilbao effect. Bilbao is in the Saint Sebastian region of Spain, and when they built this, the city was desperate to rejuvenate this old port city. A little bit like, I mentioned Miami earlier, they decided to take a chance and to build this amazing museum by Frank Gehry, and it has completely revived the economy of Saint Sebastian. So what I'm going to start to get at here is that The value of art and the ecosystem I'm describing is a lot more than just paintings and sculptures. We need to look at a wider, broader ecosystem. This is another example. This is the Pompidou Center in Paris, in the center of Paris. At the time, I mean, the Marais, that's the neighborhood it's in, it literally means swamp. I mean, this was a swamp, I want to say in the 18th, 19th century. But once again, in the late 60s, they built this. It's a library. It's packed with students all the time. The center of the city has been completely revived because of this museum. Any of you guys seen this out in Marfa, Texas? This is interesting. Marfa is another example of this. Marfa is a really cool place. There's a lot of economic activity there. Jobs are being created, etc. There's still one stoplight there. But Elm Green and Dragset did this. It's not a functioning shop. But it's another example of how art can be at the service of this kind of development. Another example, and this is a more recent one, and it's another Frank Gehry building, is the Louis Vuitton Foundation in Paris. Louis Vuitton has been an absolute pioneer in using art as a communication vehicle for their brand. We'll get into that a little bit here, but this is an interesting sort of crossover. You know, there's Louis Vuitton handbags by, this is a Japanese artist, Takashi Murakami. They did a lot of this stuff, and they're very, very active in this. Here's another example of a Louis Vuitton bag made by artists. They only have a handful of these, but they've been very, very visible and very noticeable in the way that they've been developing their brand by making partnership with artists and art institutions. Here's another great example. So this is Jay-Z and Beyonce for Tiffany's. That's a Basquiat painting, Jean-Michel Basquiat. We'll talk about him in a second here. Tiffany's actually made the claim that Basquiat used Tiffany blue. You guys know Tiffany's has that blue color. But this is an interesting display of power, honestly. So let's talk about Basquiat and Hello Kitty. Why not? Any idea why I would talk about Hello Kitty and Basquiat? Licensing. These brands are so huge now that Basquiat, rest his soul, he died when he was 27 years old in the late 80s. But his estate is generating $10 million a year now just on licensing. A little bit like Hello Kitty. So let's compare these things. That's a Basquiat phone case. You can get a Hello Kitty phone case. Makeup? Okay, I can get the Hello Kitty makeup. But Basquiat makeup? This actually exists. Just a couple more examples of this. There's Basquiat. I think that's Dom Perignon. And I don't know what the Hello Kitty champagne is. I'm just scratching the surface here. All right. So once again, we're looking at art, you know, in the case of Basquiat here more than Hello Kitty, that art is way, way beyond just the paintings in question. It's part of this broader economic system. Only a couple of artists have crossed over into this kind of pop phenomena space. Frida Kahlo is one of them, Mexican artist. Some of you guys know, amazing artist, of course. This is a Frida Kahlo bobblehead. It literally says pop icon on it. And there's a Vincent van Gogh. These are Vans. So honestly, the only artists that have really sort of crossed over, and this is arguable, but Van Gogh, Frida Kahlo, and Basquiat, you know, could make the argument that, you know, maybe Picasso or someone like that. But I mean, we're well beyond the discrete art object, as we call it. So now we can start looking at some examples of successes and failures and how this is relative to time and how you look at things. The Sydney Opera House was an abject failure when it was built. It took like 20 years. It was way over budget. The architect was run out of town. And today it's iconic. Value changes over time too, and our appreciation can either develop or even wane over time. I don't know if you guys remember The Princess Bride. This is kind of a classic now. This was a total bomb when it came out. There's countless examples of this. So once again, the value, it's hard to ascertain what it is in the short term versus the long term. Then we have some strange examples. An artist like Banksy, he is a very successful artist by any way you measure him. But he has never had like a major exhibition at a major museum. He still doesn't have the sort of institutional backing that I imagine he's interested in having. I'm not sure. But I remember hearing an interesting statistic once that half the teenagers in the UK have a Banksy poster in their room. I find that fascinating. That's cultural power right there, right? But chances are really slim that you'll ever see him at MoMA, for example. I also have to bring up NFTs. You guys remember? I think we all forgot about NFTs. These were the Bored Ape. What was it called? The Yacht Club. These things were highly speculative. Going back to one of our earlier slides, these things went up into the hundreds of thousands of dollars. There were other NFTs that went up into the millions of dollars. They are all practically worthless today. I could not help myself, but I have to bring this up. Okay. So, Timothy and the ballet and the opera. I think we all agreed that when he came out and said that there was basically no value in the opera or the ballet, we were all like, this guy is absolutely full of it. You know, we all collectively said, you know what, the value is not what he thinks it is. So I think this is an example of all of us understanding that the value is, it's not about ticket sales, for example. And I will hazard to guess that Black Swan will outlive the career of Timothy Chalamet. So I hope this is, I don't know if a little clear is the right word I'm looking for, but hopefully this was an interesting conversation about this overlap. And I could come to this conclusion. So the question is not what something is worth. It's not a quantitative question. It's about you. The question is what it's worth to you. And in what currency? What is the measuring stick that we're looking at when we're judging value in culture? And I always end up all of my discussions with this. Life is short, but art is forever. And life really is short. My God, it flies, as you all know. But this is something that's bigger than us. And if you sort of give it a chance and you invest your time and your energy and, dare I say, love into this, it can be a hugely rewarding field. And it touches on so many aspects of humanity. I mean, there's history, culture, politics, beauty, controversy. A lot of it's ridiculous. It's never boring. It's really, really fun. So I think I'll end it with that.
Thank you so much, Carlos. Yeah, let's do that. That was phenomenal. Thank you. And so now we'll open it up to questions. I know that was such a comprehensive presentation, but I'm sure it also opened up some new ideas and perspectives for you all. So we'll open it up to see if anyone wants any questions before we go into our period of discussion. Yes, please.
So you mentioned a lot of like different types of power, money, influential, ownership. And so what would you define as like the most powerful in today's world? And what would you define as like maybe like the newer term of power? I guess you could say.
I'll revert back to this slide. It depends. If somebody is purely interested in fame, then I guess it's about how many followers you have and how many clicks you get and how many likes you have or something like that. I know that there's some people involved in the art world that are incredibly discreet. The big people that win multi-million dollar bids at auction and stuff like that, they actually prefer to be incredibly discreet. I mean, they can walk down the street. I mean, you will not recognize these people, you know? So it really, really depends what kind of power we're talking. Or maybe are you thinking, can you fill that in a little bit? Like what kind of power you're thinking?
Well, I mean, there's just so many ways people define power, like silence is power, money is power, ownership of something is power, whether it's a building or an art piece. So it's interesting to see how it's applied to, like, I guess, different industries and aspects of your life. So I was wondering, like, what would you define as, like, I guess if someone's, like, true, like, they've made it in life kind of power.
That's different for everyone, isn't it? Happiness. Happiness is power. That's a great way of saying it, you know? That's a tough one. It's interesting, but at the end of the day, that's a really relative question. You know, how do you define success? There's lots of different ways of. I know artists that are unknown starving artists. They just love what they do and they're passionate about it. And my goodness, they are the most successful people in the world. How about the Vogels? They had no money and they were just building an amazing collection and having wonderful conversations. I think that's where the true power is at the end of the day is about. I would personally argue that the first two value drivers, the objects, the sort of intellectual nature of a strange, beautiful object of contemplation, that's powerful stuff right there. But once again, what might be interesting to me might not be interesting to you. And that's perfectly valid, you know? And honestly, if you get into the art world a lot and you look at hundreds and thousands of artworks over the years, I mean, there was a controversial book written years ago by a group in LA, and it was called Most Art Sucks. And I have to say, I agree with that. But the irony is what I think is great is going to be different from what you think is great, right? So the important thing is that we each sort of, through conversation, through asking questions, we get to, you know, that spot where we can identify, yes, this speaks to me. And that changes too. Some things might speak to you. There's artists that I find kind of not interesting today, but, you know, years ago, I probably found them interesting. That changes all the time. So the the sort of the measuring stick changes all the time and things change over time. An interesting thing is when we talk about artwork, sometimes if you live with art, you have this notion sometimes that, oh, every time I look at it, I see something different. And over the years, oh, it's changed so much. That is completely false. You're the one that changes. The object stays constant. So that's a really interesting mirror right there. When you live with an artwork for years and years and years, and you're in dialogue with it, and the dialogue keeps evolving and changing, but what's fascinating is you're the variable that's volatile there. The object is fixed. That's super cool. I could go on and on and on. So somebody ask another question.
There's such an interesting conversation about the value of art, both a cultural and social, but also a financial perspective. If if we are people want to support art and the continued contribution, knowing that you have some cautionary thoughts about the actual financial value of investing in art, do you think the best way to support art is from a purely philanthropic point of view? Or like what would your perspective be on art for profit and supporting the ongoing?
Art for profit in the speculative sense, buy high, sell low.
No, well, just if one wants to support art, that's a primary value. Do you think we need to purely think about it from a philanthropic sense, or is there some angle that there could be a financial merit to it?
Okay. I do have an answer to that. Everybody has a kind of threshold, depending on your financial situation, frankly, where you can sort of buy something on a whim to be supportive, to, be philanthropic, to sort of have these really good intentions. At some point, if you do want to make a purchase that kind of hurts, really stretches your pocketbook, you're probably going to have to be, which I think is very commendable, but you need to sort of understand the risks and to just be intentional about it, and be realistic about it. And honestly, hire a professional because, a lot of people get burned when they just sort of, have $100,000 and they go to Miami and they spend all this money and then they're thinking, yeah, I just got a great deal. People are probably going to be taking advantage of that. But the truth is, if you're like extremely wealthy, yeah, $100,000, there's a threshold where you can afford to make a sort of impulse buy, let's say. And obviously that's different for everyone. So there is a threshold where things do get a little bit more serious. Hope that answers your question. We can keep talking after. Do you want to follow up?
Yeah, I think it's interesting when, wealthy or even just day to day, if somebody's thinking about, I believe in the contribution that art makes to society,
Yeah.
do I need to be buying and selling art? Or are there ways that contributing that are somewhere in that fuzzy zone of like, I'm not doing it for the money alone. I'm not doing it for the culture alone. But I don't think there's a disagreed answer. It's just, I think, an interesting item.
Yeah. I think to be supportive, this is a very participatory sport. This goes back to the second, the social aspect. Join art clubs, be a member at the museum, go to the events, talk to people. Honestly, I think that kind of support is completely invaluable. That's absolutely wonderful. So just to be present, look, if you're just sitting at home and, watching auction results and maybe buying stuff online, you're participating, but you're not really contributing to the community. Yeah. Yeah. I think the best way is to contribute with your time, honestly. Will AI replace artists? It depends on what kind of art. My thinking is that things that are very graphic and kind of pixel based, that makes sense. Design, logo designers and things like this, that's going to be hard. It's really, really going to hit them very, very hard. Anything that's, like I said, very graphic and kind of pixel based. Can AI sort of make conceptual art? I don't know if it has the capacity to articulate irony and humor. Maybe one day it will. It's hard to say. I kind of feel that the fine arts or sort of conceptual art is a little bit separate from the kind of intelligence that AI uses to create logos or buildings or things that can kind of be created quickly. There was another part of the question.
How does AI come up like update what you thought like shit? Like let's say artists use AI and part of the process and it's like okay, dude, my
Okay, I'm going to answer that by changing the subject slightly. And I'm going to go back to NFTs. NFTs as artworks were dubious from the beginning, just because NFTs at the end of the day, it was digital title. All right. And it enabled artists to be able to identify their artwork wherever it was, like on the web. Right. And it was tied to a line in the blockchain and things like this. So it solved that problem of ownership of intangible digital assets. It solved that problem. And that is an aspect of NFTs that I think hasn't really been exploited. And I think in a perfect world that's a great use case for it. The banana would have been a perfect NFT, but it wasn't. It was not. And the crazy thing is that artist has done a ton of NFTs. Maurizio Catalan. I honestly do not know why that was not an NFT. The more immaterial an artwork becomes, the more it needs some sort of authentication device. And the NFTs were perfect for that. I'm just going to finish one more thought, then I'll get to you. I do know of a startup here in Austin they presented during South by Southwest. And I'm trying to remember what I think it was an AI sort of tracker. It was a sort of mix between technology that used NFTs that would track artwork that was made by AI, but referenced a real artist or a real artwork. And it would sort of tag the owner and say, hey, this AI is using essentially your IP, your intellectual property, illegally. Like go after them or not or whatever. But they were able to identify that. So yeah, interesting use cases are coming up for sure. And it's complicated, but interesting. Yeah. I'm sorry, who appraises art? You're not going to like my answer. It's the market and supply and demand. Honestly, the banana, when the banana was first made, when it was sold on the primary market, it was $100,000. That's a lot of money for a banana. Don't get me wrong. Yeah. Yeah. It was in Miami. Yeah. Yeah. On the primary market, $100,000. And where it gets, I don't want to complicate things too much here, but it was actually an edition, I believe, of 3. So there were 3 signed copies of a document that said, this is the real thing. And it was sold for, like I said, around $100,000. Years later, it was sold for, it hammered down at whatever it was, around $5 million. It could have been 3 million bucks. It could have been 10 million, you know, the secondary auction market is it's very moody. No, that can be private sales too.
So I would sell set on whoever's buying it, what they're willing to pay for it.
That's exactly right. And same thing on the private markets. And then it's more of a negotiation. It doesn't go to the highest bidder then. But if I sell something on the private market, on the secondary market, you know, I'll say, "Oh, I have this painting, it's $1 million." And the guy say, "Oh, that's ridiculous. I wouldn't pay more than 600,000." We'll say, "Well, would you take 800?" You know, then you haggle and it's like buying a car or something. But the auction is very different because there is no negotiation. It just goes to the highest bidder. If you guys ever watched, oh man, that's fascinating stuff. To watch an auction live is pretty nerve-wracking and it's fast. The average lot is like, I want to less than a minute. But the secret is they're actually sold well beforehand. It's not like people are just showing up, I like this, I'm going to throw up my paddle. They've probably been negotiating behind the scenes for weeks prior to the auction.
Uh, my question is just conceptual. What do you think is the biggest threat to art today?
That's an awesome question. People have been hemming and hawing for the last 3 years because the art market, especially the primary market, emerging artists and even mid-tier galleries, it's been hard. I mean, galleries are closing. It's kind of ugly out there. There has been a glimmer of hope, so to speak. If you listen to my podcast with Doug Woodham, he says something interesting. He said, "People have been making of art for thousands of years, and we will continue to make art for thousands of years." I don't think there is a threat to art. I think that the creative spirit of humanity, I mean, people need to make things that are a reflection of the world that we live in. It's innate, it's human, it goes back to the cave paintings. So I hope it's not a cop-out answer, but there is no immediate threat. Every now and then we talk about, oh, the market's in trouble, but people are going to still make art, you know? And there's always challenges in this space. And this is why I think it's important that if you do spend serious money in this space, just please be intentional about it. You know, I would never recommend a young artist to go into debt to get their MFA, for example. What, you're going to get $250,000 in debt with an art degree? You know, that's a threat. So, yeah, when when things become very, very serious, it's best to just sort of be intentional about it. But art will survive, you know, and it changes all the time. The oh gosh, I talk too much. Maybe I'll stop now.